Okay, so yeah, that's ready to go ahead and get things kicked off with our main speaker for the day. So let's see. So our main speaker today is Daniel Strain. Many of you know, a humanist minister, former president of HOH, and the executive director of the Spiritual Naturalist Society. So Daniel will be giving a talk on spiritual naturalism, talk about what it means to have a spiritual practice without supernaturalism, and what kinds of sources and practices make up the life of a spiritual naturalist. And then, so we'll also have plenty of time afterwards for Q&A. So please introduce your guest speaker, Daniel Strain.
Really good to see all of you again, and new faces too. Thanks for having me back, and Vic pretty much summed up what I'm going to talk about. Spiritual naturalism is probably a term that probably doesn't quite fit with the phraseology some of us here would like to use for themselves. And I'm not too concerned about semantics, but I really want to talk about the essence behind spiritual naturalism. Some of us are kind of lean more to the secular humanist side, and some of us kind of lean more to the religious humanist side. But both religious humanists and secular humanists share the same worldview, the same naturalism, the same approach to reason and evidence. It's more a matter of style and a matter of just general approach, I guess you'd say. Spiritual naturalism really centers more on a practice. So I was saying to Julie earlier that this would be a lot easier if I had about 4 or 5 hours. So, but trying to cover what I need to cover is a short time. That's the hard part. So let's see. Okay, I'll start with the 2 words, spiritual naturalism. I'll start with naturalism first because that's the easy part. I think we all know what naturalism is. And the best, easiest way to talk about it is to talk about what it's not, which is supernaturalism. So when I say naturalism, I mean naturalism as opposed to supernaturalism. And that also entails reason and evidence in our claims and what we claim to be true about the world. So spiritual naturalism has nothing to do with trying to claim that supernatural things are really natural, or nothing to do with claiming spirits as ghost-type things or anything like that. And so that's the easy part of the path of the term. Spirituality is the next one. So spirituality comes from the root word spirit, which comes from the Latin word spiritus. And spiritus originally meant wind or breath or the essence of things. There's remnants of that original definition in our use of the language today when we talk about the spirit of the law or the spirit of a nation or school spirit. Those are not the metaphors of spirit. That is the original word, spirit. It's the idea of a spirit as a ghost, as a supernatural entity. That is the thing that came later. So when we talk about, you go into a forest and you feel the spirit of the forest or the spirit of the beach or whatever, that's talking about kind of a general trend, a general vector of all kinds of feelings and emotions and sensations, and that kind of outlines the spirit of that thing, the essence of that thing. And so the spirit of the thing is the essence of the thing, the essential nature of that thing. When we talk about the human spirit, we're talking about basically the essence of who you are as a person. And to put that in more modern terms, you'd be talking about something like memes or patterns And a lot of things depend on patterns and vectors and generalities and things that have to do with relationships between entities. And so we kind of sum that up by talking about the spirit of something or the spiritual. And so for us, spirituality is about the essence of life, the essential nature of what it is to live a good life. And what I like to talk about is spiritual naturalism as a practice. So, for supernaturalists, the essence of life is about the afterlife or worshiping their deity or that sort of thing. That's why, because the majority of people have been supernaturalists in our society, they kind of dominate, their version of spirituality is what people have come to associate with spirituality. But for a naturalist, the essence of life is more akin to what Socrates talked about. What is the best way to live? Human happiness, human flourishing. They called it eudaimonia, which is basically having a healthy psychology, having a happy life. And this is talking about happiness as sort of a true, deep happiness that's not really so dependent upon circumstance. So, you've got, let me just use the two words in a very strict sense. So you've got pleasure and you've got happiness. Pleasure is like something good happened to you today, so you say that's happy, you're happy. Something bad happened to you the next day, then you say you're sad. But this kind of happiness we're talking about is more of you see it in different people who have natural sort of dispositions, or maybe they're going through a tough spot, or maybe they seem to have a kind of inner fortitude. And so this is the kind of thing that can sustain itself even through the darkest of times. And what's the difference between a person who can push on and maintain hope and that sort of thing in these dark times, and the person who is completely defeated or crushed? And the differences between those two things have to do a lot with how you view and frame the world. Things that we often kind of discredit, which is that happiness is itself a subjective experience. And so to really be able to hone in on what makes the difference between those two types of people and try to have a happier life in that sense, that's something that's different than trying to improve external conditions. That's more about working on your inner kind of way of looking at the world. And that has more to do with since happiness itself is the subjective, it's really about engineering the subjective. And that begins with admitting that subjective experience is significant, it's important, and it matters. What we call things matter. How we phrase things matter. How we weigh up things, the perspective that we look at things. Now, the good thing about spiritual naturalism is that it has divorced spirituality from claim making. So we don't use spirituality as a source of information about objective facts in the universe. From that, you use science, people who actually go do the work of observing and measuring and that sort of thing. So rather than it being about claim making, it's about what kind of attitude are you going to have about those facts? Let's see. So look, here's an example. A lot of approaches. Let's take, for example, Christianity and humanism, as typically expressed, are both kind of systems where you have a list of opinions about things. And you say, well, this is my beliefs. I believe this, or I don't believe that, or whatever. But this is what I think is the way things are. And because you have this list of opinions, that just sort of automatically makes you that thing. You agree with the 6 points of the Humanist Manifesto, you're a humanist. You agree with the what's it called? The Christian statement of, yes, you believe that, you're a Christian. So spiritual naturalism, on the other hand, this is what I mean when I say it's more about a practice. It's not so much about what you believe, but about what you do. And so, what is that practice for? What's it about? So, as a practice, its purpose is inner transformation. Doing things that build mental habits and things that build, that shift you over time in a consciously directed way toward evaluating the world in a way that you know intellectually, but you haven't yet internalized. Like very often we see things online, on social media, on Facebook, or friends send us an email, and it's these euphemisms, these things that maybe they're quotes from philosophy, or they're things that we've heard from wise people or whatever, and you read it and you think, yeah, that's right, that's good, that's true. And it has to do with things like focusing on what you control, not what you don't control. Just general good advice. And we read it and we intellectually know it's true. But we don't really deep down react psychologically to the world as though it were true. And so what happens is when the rubber meets the road, we find ourselves getting upset about something, or angry, or worried, or fearful, and then we have to remind ourselves, oh yeah, this, and we bring up some little bit of wisdom or something like that. Well, that gap, that difference between how you react to the world really and the wisdom that you know is true intellectually, decreasing that gap is what the practices of spiritual naturalism are about. So that you slowly start to bring yourself in tune with reality. And we as humanists, we want to be in tune with reality, but it goes deeper than just intellectual assent to things that are real. So, for example, when we take the advice of not getting upset about things that are outside your control, and focusing on the things of what is in your control, what can you do? Most people agree that's a good idea, and that it's healthy psychologically to do that. But there are certain practices that can help you to look at the world in a different way deeply, such that when those things come up, it becomes more of a mental habit. You don't have to remind yourself not to worry about something that's out of your control. It'll just sort of automatically happen because you've made these changes. And so, the purpose of the practice is inner transformation. And this begins by, you have to recognize that the endeavor of working on yourself, of inner transformation, is one endeavor. And then the endeavor of going out into the world and trying to spread humanism or spread rationality or engage in the culture wars or work on political issues, those are all worthy in their own right, but they're a different kind of activity. And so the working on yourself part of it, it does, at least if you take the spiritual naturalist approach, it does require kind of setting aside some of the kind of resistance you might have to taking certain approaches because it creates the impression of something religious, or somebody might misunderstand you or what have you. But if you look at all of the different traditions, whether they're religions or philosophies or schools of philosophy, they all have their terms and they use them in different ways. So to a Buddhist, compassion isn't the same thing as it is to a Catholic. That when they get into the details, it works differently. There's a kind of a different little structure of philosophy behind it. Mercy, grace, forgiveness, salvation. These words all have different connotations and different meanings within all of these traditions. So for spiritual naturalists, it's no different for them. So it's not any big deal or any real surprise that the word spirituality means something different for us than it does in other traditions. That's just the way it is. You have to learn the lexicon of the tradition in which you're operating to understand them. Let's see. Another thing that's important to note is that spiritual naturalism is not just atheism plus meditation. There's a lot of science out there about meditation right now being done, and some of the effects it has and good things about it and whatnot. And I recommend meditation. I meditate, and that is a part of my practice. But in fact, I think it's a good foundational kind of practice. But there's a whole bunch of philosophy that kind of goes along with that. Meditation can help you increase your focus, and it can help you reduce your stress, and it can help you be able to direct your attention where you want to direct it and when you want to direct it, rather than your mind going all over the place without control. But what that doesn't tell you is of what are we to be mindful and why. What do you do with that ability then? So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes along with that. Let's see. Okay, so out of that philosophy, there's all kinds of different sources of wisdom. There's modern day psychology, there's modern things like rational emotive therapy, and the modern sciences in general. But there's also a lot of surprisingly sophisticated work that's been done on that, going back to the ancient Greek philosophers, Buddhist philosophers, Taoism. All of these things have lessons in them, a wisdom stream that doesn't require the supernatural beliefs that often accompany those things. And so spiritual naturalists can take their wisdom and philosophy from any number of these sources all around the world and throughout history. Ultimately, you want them to make sense within a scientific, rational context. But they can come from all kinds of places. And so from this point forward, I'm going to kind of give you my personal cocktail of stuff that I've kind of, this seems to work together. And over the last 10 years or so, I've been doing a lot of comparative study between ancient philosophies that seem to have a lot to offer for naturalists. In other words, that don't require, they're not based on a supernatural belief. So for me, Buddhism in the East, I should put it on the other side. Buddhism in the East and Stoicism in the West. You could say more broadly Greek philosophy, but I really like Stoicism, and I think there's an amazing amount of overlap and similarity between these two. There's this whole thing called Greco-Buddhism, which is the notion of the cultural influences that go between East and West in that little space of time and geography where the Silk Road was. A lot of trade went on there. And so it's kind of unclear how much influence there was between ideas, but there's some startling similarities between their approaches here. And the reason I picked out these two, and there's little bits around the edges of Socrates over here and over here. You've got some Taoism and stuff like that that's helpful too, bits and pieces, but these are like the biggies. And the reason I kind of sit around with these, for me personally, is that these are not, and this kind of surprised me coming from a Christian background, because coming from a conservative Christian family, it was all about belief. Again, it was, if you believe, Jesus, the Son of God, Savior, you're going to go to heaven. You either believe it or you don't, and that's what you believe, and that's the whole thing. So the idea of a religion being something that you put into practice, that has practical things that it does as you go and you develop in that, was kind of foreign to me. So when I learned that about Buddhism and Stoicism, I thought, wow, this is a whole different kind of thing. And it makes sense to me as far as having something that's a source of your spirituality or a way to operate a spiritual practice without reference to the supernatural. So because they're practices, both of these have certain common things in common. What time am I going to?
Probably need to wrap up at about 2:45.
2:45.
So there's still plenty of time.
Okay, great. So some of the traits about this is that they are inward focused. Now that's not to say that we just say, screw the world, we don't care, whatever. We don't care about ourselves, we're going to focus on ourselves. The point of this is that I'm sure a lot of you have seen this in activist organizations and groups and projects. You got a lot of passionate people, and they want to make a difference in the world, and they're out there fighting the good fight. But over time, what happens is that they start to see that the problems are maybe bigger than they imagined, or they seem overwhelming. It's easy to lose hope. Or that you start to have conflicts within the group between others in which direction you take. And some of those conflicts become their own challenge, even more challenging than the thing you're trying to work together to solve. All kinds of different things. People get burned out because they either lose hope or they don't see their things coming to fruition. They've tried and they've done these things and things have failed. How do you handle that? So all of that's to say that when we have a personal practice that focuses on developing certain qualities in ourselves, it makes us stronger actors for good in the world. So it begins within. Thanks. So inward focus, that's one of the things. Focus on transformation. I've already said that. And it's chiefly about practice. And by practice, I mean not just the general sense of the word, as in practice makes perfect, but there are what you might call, let's call them formal practices. That would be things like meditation. And then there's kind of like, call that daily practices, whatever. And then there's, maybe let's call those integrated practices. These would be the kind of practices that it's not like you sit down at 8 o'clock, from 8 to 8:30, you're going to do this thing. It's something integrated with your life. So I'm going to try to smile more. I'm going to try to be kinder, or I'm going to try to be more conscious of what's important in life and what isn't important. All those kinds of things that you try to integrate into your life as you go through your day. That's what those kind of practices are. And then you have let's call them elective practices. These are things like things that are really cool to do once in a while, to try out, see if they work for you. And some people, they will, and some it won't. Kind of depends on your personality and where you are at this moment and what kind of speaks to you. Those are like, for example, I really like drum circles. I love the experience of drum circles, and that can be a spiritual practice because there's a whole we've got an article on it, but there's a whole thing about that it can be experienced in that way. You can almost enter another state of consciousness, as you put yourself. And but that would be something that maybe you don't do it every day. Maybe you don't have a standard schedule where you're going to go do that. But once in a while, you've done it, and it was a cool experience.
What's drum circle?
Well, like you might imagine, people sit in a
Around
circle.
playing
They have
drums?
drums, but there's no orchestrated thing. Everybody's kind of doing their own, and then they kind of like sync up, and you kind of get into the groove of it, and it's a really neat experience. And that brings up an interesting point I should have probably made earlier, which is that all of these practices I'll get to rituals in a minute. That was going to be my next one. But all these practices, the key thing, both in the practice and the rituals, is experience. And so, as you know, there's a difference between a person who's had a lot of experience in life and a person who hasn't. And that person can't sit down with the lesser experienced person and just tell them what they found out. Well, just tell me. Well, okay, well, here, I'm going to tell you all this stuff, and now you're going to be wise. That the older person can't just tell the person. They have to go through it. They have to experience it, right? And the reason they have to experience it is because, let me draw a little brain here. Here's your brain. Here's your eyeballs. And I like that little texture. But anyway, so you've got up here in the prefrontal area. That's you got your intellectual knowledge. It's kind of language based. But when you go through something, you got emotional stuff going on, really deep down. You've got kind of like these areas that are kind of tickled with art and music and poetry and things like that. That gets kind of your metaphorical kind of ways of looking at things. So you've got all these different areas that are fired up, and all because our brain is a network, they're all involved in it. So because they're all involved in it, it becomes deeper, more intuitive. If I tell you, yeah, the guy swung at my face and he missed me by 3 inches. Well, you know what 3 inches is. You don't have to get out a ruler. You kind of have a feel for what 3 inches is. But if I tell you something is 3 billion light years from here, you know the number 3 billion, and you know it's a long way, but you don't have a grasp in your mind of an intuitive grasp of what 3 billion miles is the way you do with 3 inches, because it's not part of your experience in the environment that you want to navigate. So you have to go through these experiences. Well, these practices and rituals and things, they're little encased moments designed to help you experience things in a kind of packaged, condensed form. And so I'll get to enlightenment later, but if you imagine you're kind of making progress in your practice, that gap is narrowing, you're becoming more in tune with the wisdom you know is true in a more intuitive, deep sense. Sometimes you'll have these little plateaus along the way. Whoa, those are big deals, when they happen. It's traditionally called a religious experience. We probably wouldn't call it that. I like to call it a profound experience. Some psychologists call it peak experience. But I have a little tinge of one with the Neil deGrasse Tyson video. It's like kind of rude, And when that happens, you got more stuff going on here than just intellectual. More than just, oh yeah, there's atoms and we're all atoms. And okay. There's more going on there. So you feel it more, it becomes a part of you more. And so these are designed to kind of help give you experiences to kind of kickstart and help you get that intellectual wisdom down deep. I really like to bring up, how many people here have seen Good Will Hunting? Okay, pretty good number of people. There's a scene in there where, Will Hunting, I guess was his name, he was a guy that had been abused as a kid. And his psychologist, Robin Williams, played him. He tells him, it's not your fault. And he's a grown man by now. He goes, yeah, I know. And he goes, no, it's not your fault. He goes, yeah, I know. And he keeps saying it, it's not your fault. And eventually, you see it getting to him. Because he knew intellectually it wasn't his fault. He was just a kid. But he didn't really know that it wasn't his fault. Deep down. It wasn't a part of who he was and how he responded to the world. And when things happened to him in life, how he responded. So, you've probably been to some things before. I had my experience with the Unitarian Church, for example. I really admire the Unitarians, and I admire what they do. Humanism, as you know, has an intimate history with the Unitarian Church. And I admire their openness, how they let everybody in, and I admire their social activism and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of times their services, and they really vary, of course, depending on the congregation, but a lot of times their services are they have ritualistic elements in them that kind of mimic Christianity a lot of times. And so probably a lot of you have had this experience where you go in and you see a ritual going on. They don't call it a ritual, but you know, whatever it is they're doing, they're lighting some candles or they're singing some songs or whatever. And you could either sit it out or you could do it, but even if you do it, it kind of feels like empty theater. Like there's no real reason for this, you know? That's what it kind of feels like. And the reason it feels like, one of the things I've been studying is why does that happen? Why does it sometimes feel like empty theater? And I believe the reason that it happens is because there's not a logical underpinning behind it that tells you, why am I doing this? What is its function? What is its purpose? How does it fit in with that overall system of practice in life that I'm going to try to build for myself? And so I've had other cases where I've done some other types of things that would be called ritual, and I was deeply moved by them, and they had a transformative effect on me. And but at that time, the difference was I kind of knew why I was doing it. I knew what it was trying to achieve. And so I could kind of let myself go and participate in it fully. And for me, some of the first glimpses of that came when we visited the Jade Buddha Temple. And so one of the things that happened was I asked the monk there, I think I mentioned this last time I spoke here about over a year ago. I asked the monk there, why do you bow to the Buddha? This happened to be a particular temple that has some very, kind of modern, rational type Buddhist people in it. There are others that take on a more supernatural side. And he said, well, that's just a piece of wood. We're not doing anything for that. We're also not doing anything for what it represents. In fact, I asked him some questions about Buddha. And what about this business about him being born from a lotus and all that? And he said, well, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't even really matter whether there was a Buddha. This is what a monk told me. So what matters is, do the practices work for you when you try them? And so the reason he bows when he comes into the room is because you've got all this stuff going on outside. You've got your phone and you're doing your stuff, and we'll get to the laundry and the thing and all the stuff and the kids and whatever. And so you come into the space because you're about to do this meditation, or you're going to focus on the Dharma talk. Dharma means wisdom. They're basically some talk about some philosophical thing that you can apply in your life. And you want to silence all that. Kind of clear off your desk, put that stuff away, and focus on what you're there to do. So when you come in and you do this physical act like this, what you're doing is you're connecting. This is perfect for naturalists because we don't believe in a dual universe where there's a body and a soul. It's all one. It's all one system. It's all atoms, like Neil deGrasse Tyson said. So everything's interconnected. So the movements you make with your body kind of affect your mind in ways that are really subtle that you wouldn't normally appreciate. They did a study one time where they had two tables set up with some just general stuff on the tables, and they had the participants in the experiment, they had to perform some complex tasks where they would get some items from here and they would bring them over to this table and they would do something else with it here, and it was just like this complicated sort of rigmarole they had to go through. And they measured how good they were at remembering what went over here when they came over here. And then they did it again, but they put a wall with a door in between, an open doorway. And when they did that, everybody's memories went to hell. And you probably experienced this too. You're like, why did I come in here? You come in here, why am I in here? And then you walk back, and when you go back into the kitchen or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, it was this. Well, your brain is like, because it's a network, it's networking with everything around it. And so part of my brain has now handed over certain functions to this thing. Part of my brain is this. This is part of my brain now because it gives up doing certain things because it knows that that's doing it. And Julie and I are that way with each other. She was saying today we've got a dual core processor. And so I have to put things in that side to make sure that they are remembered. You know, I'll say, oh, don't forget, because I want the data to be in both parts of the network. You know, so everything's interconnected with your environment. So when you do certain physical, here's another example. There's a thing that happens when you smile. And we normally think of the smile like the monitor, the output device, right? So if there's happiness going on, then the CRT will show a little smiley face, and if it's unhappy, it'll. But it's not just like that. It's a two-way street. So if you smile, it can have the reverse effect of creating genuine feelings of happiness just by the smiling, which is kind of weird, but it does that. And they even found that some people who had Botox treatments and weren't able to make certain facial expressions anymore, at least not as well, that it actually affected their ability to feel those emotions. And so that interconnectedness, and of course, as you know, Buddhism talks a lot about everything's interdependent. You have this thing called dependent origination. And these ancient terms that have been translated into English, and they sound all mystical and everything, but they're basically just saying what science says today, everything's interconnected, right? Causally connected to one another. Chains of events, that kind of stuff. That was a big deal, by the way, back then, saying that, and the Stoics called it the logos. And you have to imagine this a pre-Christian logos, which before the Christians turned that into just meaning stuff God says, right? The Word of God. But the Stoics were materialists and believed everything happened because of natural law. And the logos was the rational order by which all things happened. You'd say the laws of physics today. It doesn't sound as cool, but logos sounds good. And I like to use words like this because of what I was saying about when we call things certain things, they give us a certain attitude. And the way that I felt watching the DeGrasse Tyson thing, and of course his opposite of air, but Carl Sagan, the things that Carl Sagan would say, you have to, recently Sam Harris wrote a book called Waking Up. It's about spirituality, it's about meditation really. And he said in it that there's really no better word than spirituality, even though a lot of us don't like that word. Because when you tell somebody else, this is my spiritual practice, it's a spiritual principle of mine, these are my spiritual beliefs, this is my spiritual way, they get it. They know that's what you're talking about, is that feeling that Carl Sagan gives us when he talks about the universe. And so, for me, using words like this, I call it sacred tongue. There's other psychologists labels for it, but basically what it means is that there are things that you can communicate with language in different modes. And so you can use scientific jargon and technical speak, and it's very precise and it's very detailed, and it's great for building bridges and airplanes and helices and all of that functional stuff. It's really great for that. But there's other things that are true, literally objectively true about phenomenon that a technical description doesn't convey. They're the kinds of things that when you read poetry and a person writes about their experience on a sunset beach, maybe and this is what I love about some gifted poets and musicians, is that they're able to maybe take 4 or 5 words on a single line, and with those few words, they convey to you the essence, the spirit of what it was like to be there. And they've done it so eloquently. They've conveyed something that all of the descriptions of the frequencies of light in the sunset and the chemical compounds in the water and all of that stuff, you could describe all of that, and you would not be conveying that data. There's a certain set of data that has to do with what it is like to experience something. Can't be easily conveyed in words because our language is ultimately kind of this simplified set of symbols for reality. It's not reality. So the way it does it is by specifically being unspecific. It's by saying, well, I can't possibly convey all of the complex things that go on in an experience. It's just too much data. A simple set of words, even a big, thick scientific paper could not convey all of the intricacies of a real-life experience that your mind is taking in and comparing with your own memories and emotions and everything. And so what it does is it says, instead, I know that here's another brain over here, and I know I have this sunset experience on the beach in my mind. It's very complex and everything. I can't get it across in language, in these little boxes, very easily. But what I can do is I can send over a packet, very simple few lines, that will instead reach out and stimulate this complex network of memories that you already have in your mind. And it'll call up, using similar experiences, something like that. And when that happens, you get a much more robust sense of what it was like to be there than I could ever convey with a billion of these boxes, because I'm using your mind to recreate the experience, your billions of neurons, and I'm triggering it with a few trigger words, because we have a shared culture and a shared sort of language and what have you. So the thing about this is the kind of the basis behind sacred tongue. It's why I purposely don't use scientific, psychological, technical terms in certain contexts. I will use poetic terms. I will say spirit. I will say the natural soul instead of a mind. I'm talking about something very different than a ghost, but talking about that structure of data. And today in my talk, I'm being a lot more, I guess you'd say, analytical, specific, whatever, because I'm trying to convey an intermediate state between these two ways of talking. But in these kinds of things, practices and rituals, it's essential that we don't use overly technical jargon. It's essential that we stay in kind of that poetic, sacred tongue, because if you start using technical jargon here, you're going to lose all of that, and you're going to get sunset, water, and then you won't have that multimedia experience in your mind that has this tendency to transform the way you look at things. We do this all the time when we watch movies. All the time. In fact, I think this is one of the ways in which gay rights has advanced in our society in recent years, is that it started with things like TV shows and movies, letting you get to know people you wouldn't normally know, or maybe you don't normally have them in your life, but more people get a chance to see what their life is like and see what living life is like through their eyes, whether it's a fictional character or whether it's a dramatic retelling of something that really happened. That's different than somebody saying, hey, there was this guy and he was gay, and this is what happened to him. Instead, you see it happen on the screen. So you're taken through the experience, and it's made real to you. Maybe you didn't know anybody like that. It could be any group of people that not everybody has exposure to, because people tend to kind of clump in similar sort of cultural little subsets and things. So it conveys to people more than it could possibly convey. In a way, that's why I use movies a lot to convey things, because that's our modern mythology. And that's the role of mythology in this whole system. To provide a common set of stories that can convey, people go, oh yeah, I know what that was like, I saw that movie, or I read that poem, or I also heard that song and was moved by that music. And so this is no different. The bowing, now when we go in there, I bow. And what it does is that physical action of doing that tells my mind, put that other stuff away. And it makes it more real. Now rituals, rituals here real quick. This stuff is easier to understand because, okay, meditation, you sit there, you practice focusing your attention. One of the most basic things is focusing your attention on the breath. And the breath is really, really boring. It's the most boring thing. It's just up and down. That's all it is. But because it's boring, and because you stay focused on it, and your mind will wander. You'll start thinking about what's going on. What are we having for dinner? Oh, okay, bring it back to the breath. Then you'll start wondering about, are other people looking at me, breathing funny? Okay, bring it back to the thing. You start wondering, oh man, I got an itch with that. Bring it back to the breath. You just keep doing that. And you notice that over time, the amount of time that you can keep your attention on the breath and nothing else goes longer and longer and longer and longer. And what happens is you develop this skill to immediately silence everything else in your mind. Clear, laser-like focus on what you want to focus on. Because if you could focus on the breath, you could focus on anything. Now you take that skill and you take it into your day, into something like an integrated practice where you say, I tend to get mad at people too easy instead of understanding their point of view. Or it could be any problem. I just picked one out of random. Or it could be, I worry about things that there's no fruitfulness to worry about them because it's going to happen or it isn't. You know all that wisdom, right? But if you've got that mindfulness, you can maintain attention on what is going on, what you're doing, what you're trying to do. You're aware of what's going on in your mind as emotions arise or as thoughts arise. You're watching it from a third-person perspective. If you can do that, then you maintain the habit even more. And so whatever your integrated practice is, your thing you're trying to get better at or improve at or do better in life with, you can stay on top of it easier because you're more mindful throughout the day. In fact, the reason I wear these is because that's another tactic to be mindful, is wearing something or having some physical thing. A while back I was trying to develop a habit. And I heard somebody else had done this, so I tried it. I was trying to remember to eat healthier, okay? And I've still got a long way to go with that, obviously. But it did help me, and I developed the habit much better than I ever thought I could have. And what I did was, it's so silly. It seems so silly. But what it is you get a little stone, and you hold it in your hand. And that stone is that idea, that principle, whatever it is you're trying to remember. Because often what would happen is, it wasn't that I was, I gotta have that donut or whatever. I didn't have any temptation problems. It was more like this little lizard brain guy down here waits till he's not looking and then starts going, yeah, let's go do this. and so I eat and I'm like, oh no, I ate the thing and I wasn't supposed to eat the thing. And so I wasn't staying mindful of it. And so I had that little stone and I just kept it in my hand. It was really inconvenient, but I kept it in my hand and sure enough, I stayed mindful. I always knew that damn stone was right there. I never could forget it. And after I went a week or so, which is 21 meals, they say you do something 21 times, you build a habit. That was it. I was able to build a habit, and then I could put the stone in. And it's also kind of funny how I got the stone. Something that sounds even crazier. But I read Carlos Castaneda's book, his first one. You guys know who that is? Okay, he's basically a...
You're talking about the teachings of Don Juan?
Yeah. He is not a spiritual naturalist. Okay, so don't think you're going to read that book. But he talks about a lot of LSD experience. Not LSD. What's that? Peyote experiences in the desert with shaman and all this stuff. And it's real fascinating because he stays in the first-person perspective throughout all these experiences. But anyway, so one of the things the little guy he was getting teachings from said was, go find your place on the porch. He said, okay, and he sat down somewhere and he goes, no, that's not your place, you gotta find your place. where he was going to do the teachings and stuff. And so it took him like all night. When he finally found it, he knew that was the place. And it sounds crazy, but anyway, so I was kind of thinking of that in the back of my mind. I thought, okay, so I'm not just going to get any stone. It has to be a stone that speaks to me in some way. And of course, I don't believe that there's any kind of like stone spirit going, ooh, come to me. You know, I don't think anything of that's happened, but our minds are very complex. There's a lot of stuff going on below the surface. And so, like kind of like an art project, I decided to just go outside and walk around and not say, try not to tell myself it's going to be this big, it's going to be this, whatever. And just wait till a stone just kind of catches my eye and feels right. And I think something about doing that helped the process. And I can't even explain why. I'm not a psychologist, but those little things like that, the willingness to kind of experiment and kind of jump out there and try some things, see what they're like. One time we even did a thing where everybody laid down in a circle and they beat these drums and repetitive drums, and eventually you go into this thing and you're supposed to imagine things, and it kind of a lot of people there believed that some spirit stuff was going on, or some ghost stuff, I should say, was going on. But I looked at it as kind of an exploration of your subconscious, what's on your mind. You'll notice that too when you meditate. The things that pop up when you're trying to focus on your breath aren't necessarily the things you think will pop up. So that tells you something about what's on your mind too. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting stuff like this. This is why I said I could go on forever talking about this. Rituals are actions that you go through. If you're doing them right, if you're going to get anything out of them, they have to be something that you completely, unconsciously kind of allow yourself to have an experience while you're doing it. If you go up there and you take the bread and the wine and you do the thing and you do the stuff and you're like, and you get out, that's just like trying to meditate and you sit there and you're thinking about your car or something. You're just wasting your time. That's the empty theater. But if you understand like the purpose it's about, if you understand what you're trying to achieve with meditation, what meditation is for, if you understand when you do drumming in a ritual, what you're trying to get a sense for or experience there, then it makes sense to you. And then you can kind of give yourself over to it. Kind of go into not an irrational state, but an irrational state. And the irrational, we're against that, right? Reason. Irrational is just saying, well, there's these other things too. They're not the kind of things that you would wrap up with language and logic, but they're parts of being human and they're parts of experience. And they just have to do with human nature, just the way we're structured, just the way we've evolved. And that you can make use of that as a tool for changing your perspectives over time. Now, I've totally skipped a part that I wanted to make sure covered. Let me remind myself quick. You said till 3:45, right? Okay, I'll just go ahead and start with the question and answer stuff.
3:45.
3:45?
2:45.
2:45. We need to be out of the building
7
by
minutes.
3.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and go to Q&A then. Yeah.
Okay.
Any questions? Yes.
You got into an elevator with someone, and you had to explain what spiritual naturalism was before you got content for it. How would you do that?
I hit the red button. No, okay, I'll try to give you the elevator speech.
Or you can stand on one foot. How about that?
Yeah, it's really hard. Basically, I would say spiritual practices to work on yourself to be a happier person without the need of that in practices that are not based in any way on supernatural beliefs or faith beliefs. But every time you break it down smaller and smaller, the simpler you are with a statement, the more complex the questions and stuff would have to come out.
Usually you talk about these rituals, you say the bar, but so is there any of those rituals that are common? Because it could be that this doesn't work for me, or
Right. Yeah, there's way more than I could even go into. I talk about meditation a lot because it's a very broad, foundational kind of attention focusing skill that you can use then to do other things. And so it's like a major thing. Bowing is not important. That's just a random thing I picked out that told me something about ritual. But I would say the way you kind of find what's right for you is you think about times where you've been moved or been transformed in some way, or you've never looked at things the same way again after that happened. It could be a real life incident, or it could be a type of music you listen to, or something like that. And then you start thinking about, well, what is it about that song or about that kind of music that moves me and why? And let me go listen to some now and purposely let yourself, you can do that kind of thing. There's also communal rituals. You can join in on these different things which are other people are doing together. And sometimes that's kind of scary or embarrassing, but other times it's cool and you can find out some things you wouldn't have normally.
Did you ever get involved in any of the rituals that were described in the teachings of Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda?
Nothing that elaborate. That's some pretty wild stuff. And I don't even necessarily know yet. There's still so much to explore and investigate about
The peyote ritual is,
what use would it have for us. Some things aren't going to be useful in an context. Other things will.
the peyote ritual is, if you go through the whole bit, the sweat lodge and so forth, has many enlightening features in it.
Oh, have you done it?
Been to a sweat lodge.
Yeah. So you kind of know what I'm talking about.
I'd like to do a deter ritual, but I haven't found a brujo that I trust. But the deter is an alkaloid, and if they mess it up, you don't live through it.
Yeah, that's pretty rough. So I wouldn't advise starting with that. But
You don't mess with the
and some people, that's never right for them, right? But there are many ways to get into altered states of consciousness. They're all different from each other. And they're one way of having an experience that may or may not be right for a person, or may not produce the results. But there's all kinds of different ways.
There's a book out called, I think it's called Be 10% Happier, written by Dan Harris, who is an ABC News anchor. And he recommends a meditation, like for 5 minutes, just kind of think about things you want to do that you'll be proud of, and connecting with your friends, and you just put yourself, I guess, in a more positive, happy mood by meditating maybe 5 minutes a day. I don't do it myself, but it sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's neat about it, is that there's a lot of these where just doing a little bit and you notice it's not enlightenment or whatever, but it's a little helpful. You notice some things right away. In fact, that reminds me of what I was going to say over here. I'll squeeze it in real quick. I stayed over here a lot, but over on this side, some of the most powerful things I experienced were in learning about Stoicism and then applying it. And in Stoicism, there's two things in particular. I mentioned the control thing, the approach to control, really staying conscious of what is in your control and what is not in your control. Even things we say that are in our control really aren't. Like, to the Stoics, things not in your control include wealth, health, reputation, things that this world tells you, this culture tells you are within your control. But their point is, you do all the right stuff, a rock falls on your head, you're not really as in control as you think you are, so you better be prepared for the stuff that could happen. The other thing is I call it the judgment doctrine, but it's this idea that you've got stimulus, the stuff that happens out in the world, and then you've got your emotional response to it. And, or that's usually what people are more concerned about. You got your emotional response to it, and what a lot of people don't realize is that in between here is a judgment. Somebody keys your car and you get upset about it. Well, there couldn't possibly be in our genetics a thing that says you shall get angry when your car is keyed, because cars didn't exist when we evolved. So some part of you somewhere is making a judgment that getting angry at the car being keyed is a helpful response. And so many times it's not. In fact, a lot of times we like to try to justify that stuff, but you can do all kinds of stuff. You can go have a guy arrested, you can do everything you need to do, but what's not required is inner turmoil as you do it. But some part of your mind thinks it is required, thinks that that's helpful in some way, and all you're doing is just giving yourself a bad day. So anyway, that's just quick little parts of Stoicism I thought were really cool. Any other questions?
I see a lot of parallels between what you're saying here and Eastern and Western philosophy. And it seems to me that Eastern philosophy, Hinduism, for example, that what they're really talking about is a philosophy. The word they use, I think, is Dharma. And Buddhism is really built upon that sort of philosophy. I mean, Buddha didn't see himself as different from all the other Eastern philosophers. And there's a similar thing among the Greeks. You know, the Greeks were interested in philosophy, and there were various schools of philosophy. The Stoics were one school, but there were others, you know, the Epicureans and so on. And we have a lot to learn from all of these things, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you've done a good thing for us. You're showing us a particular way of looking at these things. But
Yeah, definitely
there are other
Epicureanism.
ways too.
I'm sorry?
There are other ways.
Yeah, definitely. I picked out two because I knew I only had a limited time, and I decided to pick out things I like to focus on. Like I said, this is my personal cocktail. There's Epicureanism, some people like that a lot. There's just basic Socrates. There's even the Academy and Plato, Aristotle, all that stuff. That lineage tends to go into, because of the ideal forms thing, tends to go into early influences into Christianity and the advent of supernaturalism and all that. So in a lot of ways, that kind of is a different arc that Stoicism and Epicureanism took. But there could be some things in there that are useful. It could be anywhere. And so a big part of the practice is in building your own practice and exploring. And I find that an exciting part.
All right. Well, yeah, I think we need to go and wrap things up. Sorry, but yeah, thank you very much for the